I never planned to restore a 100-year-old lake ranch. When I first bought the property, it wasn't some romantic dream about history or legacy. It was quiet land at the edge of a glassy lake, tucked far enough from town that mornings stayed silent and nights stayed honest. The ranch had been neglected for decades, with collapsing fences, rotting docks, and a farmhouse that leaned slightly east, like it was tired of standing. Still, the deed was clear, the boundaries were surveyed, and the county records went back further than most of the homes around it. I moved in slowly. At first, it was just weekends spent clearing brush, repairing the old gravel drive, and hauling trash that previous owners had abandoned. Neighbors waved from a distance. A few stopped by and told me stories about the ranch, about how their grandparents used to fish the lake or ride horses along the shore. Nothing felt hostile. Nothing felt contested. It felt like I was bringing something back that had been asleep. The restoration wasn't flashy. I didn't build anything new. I repaired what already existed. The dock was rebuilt using the original pilings. The fencing followed the same line shown on survey maps from the 1920s. Even the farmhouse renovations kept the original footprint intact. I filed permits, pulled records, and had inspectors walk the land with me. Every step was documented, stamped, and approved. That's why the first letter surprised me. It came from the local homeowners association, even though my property wasn't part of the subdivision. The tone was polite but firm, saying there had been concerns about my recent activity near the lake. No accusations yet, just language about community standards and shared access considerations. I assumed it was a misunderstanding. Old land often confuses new boards. I responded calmly, attaching copies of my deed, survey maps, and the county approval notices. I explained that the ranch predated the HOA by nearly 70 years and had never been incorporated into their development. I even invited a representative to walk the property with me if they had questions. I wasn't defensive. I had nothing to hide. Over the next few weeks, the work continued. Sunrise mornings repairing barn beams. Long afternoons restoring stonework along the shoreline. The lake slowly reflected something cared for again. I started hearing more from neighbors, mostly positive. People thanked me for cleaning up an eyesore. A couple said the ranch finally looked like it belonged there again. Then I met her. She showed up unannounced, standing at the edge of my driveway with a clipboard and a tight smile. She introduced herself as part of the HOA leadership and immediately began talking, not asking. She said there were serious concerns about ownership, about historical access, about how her son had always believed that stretch of land belonged to their family. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, I told her the same thing I'd put in writing. The land was mine legally, historically, and provably. Her smile faded. She said we'd be hearing more about this. I watched her walk back to her SUV, dust kicking up behind her tires. That was the moment I realized restoring old land doesn't just uncover buried foundations. Sometimes, it uncovers buried entitlement too. I still believed at that point that facts would settle everything. Deeds, dates, and records had always been enough before. I had no idea that history, when challenged by ego, can suddenly become a battleground instead of a reference. That assumption would be tested far sooner than I expected, in ways unimaginable. The next contact didn't come as a letter. It came as a notice taped to the restored barn door, bright paper flapping in the wind like it wanted to be seen. It claimed my recent work violated lakefront uniformity standards and demanded I halt all restoration immediately. There was a deadline, a threat of fines, and a reference number that meant nothing to me. The signature belonged to the same woman I'd met at the driveway, now using official letterhead to give her confidence weight. I called the HOA office that afternoon. I kept my tone measured and factual, the same way I'd handled permits and inspectors. I explained again that my land wasn't under their authority, that the ranch existed long before their bylaws, and that I had already provided documentation. The receptionist transferred me without comment. When she came on the line, her voice was clipped and rehearsed. She said the board was reviewing historical usage and that my cooperation would avoid complications. The implication was clear. Compliance was expected, not discussion. Over the next few days, the pressure increased. Another notice arrived, this time alleging I had blocked traditional access to the lake. That access, according to my survey, ran through my pasture and had been closed since the 1980s. Still, the HOA framed it as a community right. Neighbors began stopping by less. A few avoided eye contact. Rumors travel faster than facts when authority speaks first. I responded in writing again, attaching older records this time. Hand-drawn plots from the county archive. Photographs dated decades before the subdivision existed. Tax assessments showing uninterrupted ownership. I wasn't trying to win an argument. I was trying to end it. Facts had always been the finish line. Instead, the notices escalated. The HOA scheduled a compliance hearing and listed my property address as if it were part of their jurisdiction. They warned of daily fines if I failed to appear. I attended, not because I recognized their authority, but because I wanted everything on record. The meeting room was crowded, mostly board members and a few residents. She sat at the center, confident, prepared, already convinced. They spoke about aesthetics, about precedent, about how the lake belonged to the community. When it was my turn, I calmly stated the ranch's history, presented copies of deeds, and explained that community sentiment didn't override county law. A couple of board members looked uncomfortable. She didn't. She said her son had grown up believing that land was his future, and that paperwork didn't change legacy. That was when the tone shifted. It stopped being about rules and became personal. She accused me of exploiting loopholes, of taking advantage of technicalities. She implied that restoring the ranch was a provocation. I kept my voice steady and repeated one sentence. Ownership is not a feeling. It's a record. When the meeting ended, no resolution was reached. Instead, I received a formal warning the next morning. It stated the HOA would pursue enforcement options if I didn't cease activity. The language was vague on purpose, meant to intimidate without committing to facts. I realized then that clarity wasn't their goal. Control was. I still hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't blocked anyone, threatened anyone, or ignored the law. Yet somehow, I was being treated like an aggressor. Standing on land I'd owned legally, restoring structures that had stood longer than their neighborhood, I was now the problem in their narrative. That realization marked the end of confusion and the beginning of something else entirely. By the following week, the situation stopped feeling bureaucratic and started feeling hostile. A county inspector arrived unannounced, citing an anonymous complaint about unauthorized shoreline alteration. I recognized the phrasing immediately. It mirrored the HOA notices almost word for word. I walked the inspector through the permits, the photographs, the approvals already on file. He nodded, took notes, and quietly admitted everything appeared compliant. Still, the visit was logged. A record existed now, even if it went nowhere. That pattern repeated itself. Another inspector. Then a surveyor hired by the HOA, standing just outside my fence line with a tablet and a skeptical expression. I asked him to leave. He claimed he was documenting potential encroachments. I reminded him that private property didn't become public simply because someone wanted it to be. He left, but not before taking pictures from the road. The fine started soon after. Small at first, then daily. Each one referenced violations that didn't apply to my land, but correcting them took time, letters, certified mail, and patience. I noticed trucks slowing down as they passed the ranch. People watching, whispering. The story circulating wasn't about restoration anymore. It was about conflict, about someone taking something that didn't belong to them. The pressure peaked when a deputy showed up one afternoon. He was professional, almost apologetic, explaining he'd been asked to conduct a welfare and compliance check. I invited him inside, laid out the paperwork, and showed him the boundary markers embedded in the soil. He looked at the dates, the stamps, the signatures. Then he told me, quietly, that this wasn't the first call from that HOA about this property. He closed his notebook and left without issuing anything, but the message was clear. They were willing to escalate outside their lane. What bothered me most wasn't the inconvenience. It was the deliberate misrepresentation. The HOA board had begun telling residents that I was blocking lake access, damaging shared resources, and refusing to cooperate. None of it was true. I had documentation for everything, but narratives don't require proof. They require repetition. And they were repeating it everywhere. I stayed calm. Outwardly. I continued the restoration during permitted hours. I greeted neighbors politely. I responded to every notice in writing. But something shifted internally. I realized I was no longer dealing with a misunderstanding or an overzealous board. I was dealing with someone who felt entitled to rewrite history to fit her expectations, and who believed pressure would eventually make me give in. The breaking point came when I found survey stakes driven into my pasture overnight, marking a proposed easement. No permission. No notice. Just lines drawn across grass that had been undisturbed for generations. That wasn't confusion. That was a claim. I removed the stakes and documented everything. Photos. Video. Dates. I filed a report, not because I expected immediate action, but because I wanted a paper trail that couldn't be dismissed. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not out of fear, but out of clarity. I finally understood the shape of the conflict. This wasn't about rules or access or community standards. It was about power, about someone who believed proximity created ownership, and that persistence could replace proof. They thought escalation would force compliance. They were wrong. For the first time since buying the ranch, I stopped reacting and started planning. Not emotionally. Methodically. I gathered every record I had, then went looking for the ones I didn't. If they wanted to turn history into a weapon, I would make sure history was sharp, precise, and the moment I stopped responding and started preparing, everything changed. I took a week off from physical restoration and shifted my focus entirely to records, boundaries, and history. Not the surface-level documents I'd already shared, but the deep ones. The kind that predate opinions and outlast pressure. I went back to the county archive, not the online portal, but the basement where original plats were stored in climate-controlled drawers. That's where the ranch first appeared, inked by hand, long before the lake was dammed and long before anyone thought of calling the area a subdivision. Those records told a story that couldn't be argued with. The ranch wasn't just older than the HOA. It was the anchor property the entire area had been mapped from. Roads curved around it. Parcels were carved out of its edges decades later, sold off piece by piece as development crept in. What the HOA now called traditional access was once a temporary construction path used when the neighborhood was first built, never recorded as an easement, never transferred, never renewed. When construction ended, the access ended with it. I pulled title histories going back a full century. Each transfer was clean. No gaps. No overlaps. No claims from the family she kept invoking. Her son's name never appeared anywhere. Not as an owner, not as a beneficiary, not even as an adjacent party with rights. The belief that the land belonged to him wasn't inherited. It was imagined. I hired my own surveyor, one with experience in disputed land cases. We walked the perimeter together, matching iron pins to archival maps. Every marker lined up. When he finished, he told me something that stuck. He said disputes like this rarely start because the facts are unclear. They start because someone refuses to accept them. His report was precise, unemotional, and devastating to any counterclaim. At the same time, I consulted a property attorney. I didn't want threats. I wanted insulation. We compiled a response packet that included everything: historical plats, surveys, title chains, correspondence logs, and a timeline showing how the HOA's actions escalated despite repeated clarification. It wasn't aggressive. It was comprehensive. The kind of file that makes people reconsider how far they want to push. I didn't send it immediately. That was intentional. Instead, I waited and watched. Another notice arrived, claiming I'd removed community markers. I logged it. Another fine was issued. I logged that too. Each overreach added weight. Each false claim strengthened the record. Then I took one final step. I filed a formal notice with the county asserting exclusive ownership and lack of easements, supported by the survey and historical documentation. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was a declaration. A line drawn in the same system that had recorded the ranch for 100 years. Once filed, it became part of the public record, searchable, permanent, and enforceable. Only then did I respond. One letter.
Come.
Brief. It stated that the property was not subject to HOA authority, that no access rights existed, and that further attempts to assert control would be treated as trespass and harassment. Attached was the full packet. No accusations. No emotion. Just facts, indexed and undeniable. I didn't know how she would react, but I knew something else. I was no longer on defense. I had shifted the terrain entirely. The story they'd been telling relied on pressure and noise. What I'd prepared relied on permanence. And permanence doesn't argue. It waits. The next morning, the results of all that preparation became clear faster than I could have imagined. She arrived again, the same tight smile on her face, clipboard in hand, expecting confrontation. Instead, she found the driveway empty of equipment, the restored barns standing proud, and a printed notice on the front door. My formal declaration of ownership, backed by century-old plats, surveys, and legal filings. She read it slowly, her confidence faltering with every line. Within hours, I began receiving calls, not from me, but from neighbors who had once whispered, now wanting clarification. They'd heard about the filings, the surveys, the title history. A few admitted they had assumed she was right, that the land had somehow belonged to her son. The proof changed minds faster than words ever could. By midday, HOA board members were calling, each voice more cautious than the last, asking for copies of my documentation and clarification about the disputed access. Their tone had shifted from commanding to conciliatory. Authority had become awareness. Then came the most unexpected moment. Her son himself reached out, clearly instructed by her, though I never spoke to her directly. His tone was curious, even hesitant. He asked questions about the ranch's history, the restoration, the permits. He was no longer claiming, arguing, or threatening. The land that had once been a battleground now commanded respect simply because it was undeniable. The truth had done what my patience, planning, and preparation could not have accomplished alone. The HOA, for all their threats, suddenly found themselves powerless. They could no longer issue fines, warnings, or hearings that had any legal standing. Attempts to intimidate me ceased almost overnight, replaced with cautious observation and reluctant acknowledgement. The property, restored and defended, stood as both home and monument. Every fence post, every repaired dock beam, every mile of cleared trail testified not just to the work, but to rightful ownership. In the weeks that followed, I returned to a quiet rhythm. Restoration continued, but without fear of interference. I greeted neighbors with confidence rather than caution. I walked the lakeshore in the evenings, listening to the water, knowing that no one could dispute what had been restored and defended. The ranch's century-long story was secure, its history intact, and my place on it unchallenged. The lesson was clear, though subtle. Power often comes dressed as authority, and persistence can masquerade as truth. But when facts are documented, prepared, and applied strategically, they speak louder than any shout, any letter, any fine. I had not yelled, threatened, or retaliated. I had let history, law, and evidence do the talking. The payoff was complete: justice without chaos, victory without compromise, and a restored lake ranch that now belonged, undeniably, to me. And as I stood on the dock one evening, the lake reflecting the last light of the day, I realized something deeper. This ranch wasn't just a piece of property. It was proof that patience, preparation, and respect for history could withstand entitlement, intimidation, and false claims. HOA Karen had screamed, she had threatened, and she had tried to rewrite the past, but the truth endured. And it always would.